Chapter 1. Echoes Beneath the Surface. The city of Lamora was a spectacle of light and steel, its skyline glimmering like a constellation brought to Earth. Skyscrapers pierced the heavens, their surfaces adorned with holographic displays that hummed with the pulse of human ambition. Below, the streets bustled with people dressed in synthetic fabrics, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of personal devices. Order and efficiency were the pillars of Lumora's society, but for Dr. Celeste Ian, they felt more like walls that closed in tighter with each passing day. Celeste's lab was perched high in the Stellar Research Complex, an ivory tower for one of the city's brightest minds. She specialized in quantum biophysics, a field so niche and abstract that even her colleagues sometimes struggled to understand her work. But tonight, her thoughts were not on equations or experiments. They were on the persistent anomaly she had been tracking for weeks, an unexplained energy signature deep beneath the city. The anomaly first appeared during a routine scan of Lumora's subterranean systems. At first glance, it resembled nothing more than a glitch in the data. But the readings grew stronger, stranger, until they defied all known parameters. Pulses of energy radiated in intricate patterns, as if the phenomenon itself was alive, breathing, waiting to be discovered. Celeste's curiosity, a trait that had often drawn her into trouble, refused to let her dismiss it. On this particular night, as rain streaked against the reinforced glass of her lab, Celeste made her decision. She packed her portable analyzer, donned a lightweight exploration suit, and descended into the depths of Lamora. The city's sterile brilliance faded as she ventured into the Undercity, where maintenance tunnels stretched like veins beneath the metropolis. The air grew colder, the hum of machinery distant and ghostly. Her tracker's display glowed faintly in the dim light, guiding her deeper into the maze of steel and concrete. The anomaly's signal grew stronger, its rhythm a mesmerizing pulse that seemed almost musical. Celeste felt a strange exhilaration, as if she were standing on the edge of a great discovery. Yet unease prickled at the edges of her mind. There was something otherworldly about this place, something the rational part of her struggled to explain. Finally, the signal led her to a section of the tunnels that had been marked as restricted. The walls were lined with warning signs, their bright red letters stark against the gray. Unauthorized access prohibited. Celeste hesitated, her finger hovering over the lock override on her suit's wrist panel. She was no stranger to breaking protocol, but this felt different, more dangerous. Still, the pull of the unknown was too strong to resist. The door hissed open, revealing a cavernous chamber bathed in an eerie, shifting glow. The walls were smooth and black, as if carved from obsidian, and veins of luminous energy coursed through them like liquid light. In the center of the chamber stood a figure. Celeste froze. The figure was humanoid but unmistakably otherworldly. Its skin shimmered like molten silver, and its eyes glowed with a soft, golden light. It turned to face her, and she felt a wave of emotions wash over her. Curiosity, caution, and an odd sense of recognition, as if she had been searching for this moment all her life. "Who are you?" Celeste managed to whisper, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. The being tilted its head, studying her with an intensity that made her heart race. When it spoke, its voice was melodic, resonant, and unlike anything she had ever heard. "I might ask the same of you. Why have you come here, to a place your kind was never meant to see?" Celeste swallowed hard. "I'm a scientist. I've been tracking an energy signature, something unexplainable. I didn't know what I would find, only that I had to find it." The being stepped closer, and Celeste's instinct screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to move. "You're brave," it said, its golden eyes softening. "Or foolish. Perhaps both." "What are you?" she asked, her voice steadier now. It hesitated, as if weighing its answer. "I am Kale," it said finally, "a guardian of this place, and of secrets your world is not ready to understand." Celeste felt a pang of indignation. "You don't know what my world is ready for. You don't know what I'm ready for." Kale smiled faintly, and for a moment, the tension between them eased. "Perhaps you're right, but this meeting is not without consequence. Your presence here will not go unnoticed." "By who?" Celeste asked, but Kale's gaze shifted to the chamber's entrance, as if sensing something beyond her comprehension. "Leave now," Kale said, urgency sharpening their tone. "If you value your life, go back to your world and forget what you've seen." "I can't do that," Celeste said, her voice firm. "I won't." Kale's eyes searched hers, a silent battle of wills unfolding in the charged air. Finally, they sighed, a sound that carried both resignation and intrigue. "Then you've chosen your path. But know this, Celestian. The darkness you've stepped into is not so easily escaped." Before she could respond, the chamber began to tremble. The glowing veins in the walls pulsed faster, their light intensifying. Kale raised a hand, and Celeste felt a force, gentle but unyielding, push her toward the door. "Go," Kale urged. "This place will not remain hidden for long. And when it is revealed, neither of our worlds will ever be the same." With a reluctant glance back at Kale, Celeste obeyed. The door sealed behind her, leaving her alone in the silent tunnel. Her heart pounded as she retraced her steps. The memory of Kale's golden eyes burned into her mind. As she emerged into the cold, artificial light of the city above, one thought consumed her. She had to return. Whatever secrets lay beneath Lamora, whatever danger awaited, she couldn't turn away. Not now. The echoes of that hidden world had awakened something in her, a longing, a purpose she had never known, and she would follow it, even if it led her into the heart of darkness itself. Chapter 2. Through Shattered Glass. The days following her discovery passed in a haze for Dr. Celestian. She carried on with her duties at the Stellar Research Complex, her hands moving through the motions of calibrating instruments and analyzing data, but her mind was elsewhere. The encounter with Kale haunted her. Their luminous eyes, the unearthly resonance of their voice, and the weight of their words. She had told no one about the subterranean chamber or its enigmatic guardian. Her instincts warned her against sharing something so extraordinary with her colleagues, who were as bound by the rules of Lamora as the drones that patrolled the city's skies. Yet, the secret pressed heavily on her, as if the very act of containing it might cause her to fracture. It was a cold, clear night when she made her decision. The city's lights stretched endlessly before her as she stood on the balcony of her small apartment, the air humming with the faint whir of airborne transports. Below, the streets bustled with the unrelenting rhythm of progress, but Celeste felt disconnected from it all. The world she had devoted her life to studying suddenly felt sterile, hollow. She had seen something beyond the glass and steel confines of Lamora, and there was no returning to ignorance. She packed her exploration suit and the portable analyzer once more, her movements swift and precise. This time, she prepared for resistance. She knew that restricted zones were monitored, that she might encounter automated defenses or even the city's security forces. But she couldn't let fear deter her. Someone, was waiting for her in the darkness below, and she needed answers. The Undercity was as labyrinthine as she remembered, but the path to the hidden chamber seemed etched into her memory. Her tracker guided her through the winding tunnels, the anomaly's signal now a steady beacon. She moved quickly, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. When she reached the door to the chamber, she paused only briefly before overriding the lock. The room was as she had left it, its obsidian walls alive with glowing veins of energy. But this time, Kale was not alone. 3 other figures stood near the center of the chamber, their forms similar to Kale's but subtly different. One had a faint bluish hue to their skin, another's eyes shimmered like emeralds, and the third exuded an almost tangible warmth, as if their very presence radiated heat. Kale turned to her, their expression unreadable. "You returned," they said, their voice a mix of wonder and caution. "I didn't think you would." "I had to," Celeste replied, stepping forward. She glanced at the others, who regarded her with varying degrees of curiosity and suspicion. "I need to understand what's happening here, who you are, what this place is." The figure with emerald eyes spoke, their tone sharp. "She's a risk, Kale. You should have turned her away." "And if I had?" Kale replied evenly. "She would have returned anyway. Humans are nothing if not persistent." Celeste bristled at their words, but chose to focus on the questions burning in her mind. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "I've studied energy phenomena my entire life, but nothing like this exists in the human world. Are you extraterrestrial?" Kale's lips curved into a faint smile. "Extraterrestrial? No. We are as much of this world as you are, though our origins are ancient." The warmth radiating figure stepped closer, their voice soothing but firm. "This place is a sanctuary, a refuge from your kind. For centuries, we have lived in the shadows, our existence hidden to protect both our people and yours." "Protect us?" Celeste's brows knitted together. "From what?" The bluish figure's voice was like the whisper of a storm. "From yourselves. Humans fear what they cannot control. If they knew of us, they would see us as threats, weapons to be wielded or destroyed." Celeste's gaze darted to Kale, who had remained silent. "And what do you think?" she asked, her voice softer now. "Do you see me as a threat?" Kale's golden eyes met hers, their expression unreadable. "I see you as a bridge," they said at last. "A fragile one, but a bridge nonetheless. Whether it will unite or shatter our worlds remains to be seen." The tension in the room thickened, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on them all. Celeste's mind raced with questions, but before she could speak, the chamber trembled. The glowing veins in the walls pulsed erratically, their light dimming and brightening in rapid succession. "They found us," the emerald-eyed figure said, their voice tight with urgency. "Who?" Celeste asked, her heart hammering. Kale's gaze darkened. "The enforcers. Your kind's protectors. They must have detected your earlier visit." Panic flared in Celeste's chest. "What do we do?" The warmth radiating figure placed a hand on her shoulder, their touch calming despite the chaos. "You need to leave. If they find you here, they'll have all the proof they need to escalate their efforts against us." "I won't abandon you," Celeste said firmly. "This is my fault. If I hadn't come here." "If you hadn't come," Kale interrupted, "you would still be living in ignorance. And perhaps that would have been kinder. But now, you must choose. Retreat to your world and fight for us from there, or stay and risk everything." The choice hung in the air, heavy and impossible. Celeste's mind raced, but she knew one thing for certain. Whatever path she chose, it would change her life forever. Chapter 3. A Light Hidden in Shadows. The sharp chill of Lumira's air hit Celeste as she emerged from the Undercity, her mind reeling with everything she had seen. The streets were quiet now, bathed in the sterile glow of overhead lights. Her exploration suit bore faint traces of the subterranean world. A smear of dust here, a faint glow of residual energy there. But she moved quickly, blending into the late-night calm. The encounter in the hidden chamber had left her shaken but resolute. She couldn't walk away, not now. Not ever. Her apartment felt suffocating when she returned, its sleek, minimalist design a reminder of the life she had once embraced so fully. She dropped her gear onto the floor and collapsed onto the edge of her bed. Her thoughts a chaotic swirl of Kale's golden eyes, the chamber's glowing veins, and the looming threat of the enforcers. The weight of her choices bore down on her, pressing against her chest like an iron band. Sleep eluded her that night. Instead, she pored over her data, the faint hum of her tablet the only sound in the otherwise silent room. The readings from the hidden chamber were unlike anything she had ever encountered. Energy patterns that defied known physics, rhythmic pulses that suggested sentience, and traces of a material she couldn't identify. It was as if the chamber itself was alive, an extension of the beings who called it home. But it wasn't just the science that consumed her. It was the memory of Kale. Their presence lingered in her mind like a melody she couldn't forget, a resonance that seemed to stir something deep within her. She didn't understand it, not yet, but she knew it was significant. By morning, she had made her decision. She couldn't turn her back on what she had discovered, nor could she ignore the danger that Kale and the others faced. If the enforcers were truly closing in, then time was running out. She needed to act. The Stellar Research Complex was a hive of activity when she arrived, its sleek corridors filled with scientists, engineers, and administrators. Celeste moved with purpose, her usual quiet demeanor replaced by a steely determination. Her first stop was her lab, where she retrieved a specialized data module. If she was going to help Kale and the others, she needed information. On the enforcers, on the anomaly, and on anything that could give her an edge. Her second stop was less official. The archives, a sprawling digital repository housed deep within the complex, contained records that spanned centuries of Lumira's history. Accessing the restricted sections required clearance she technically didn't have, but Celeste had always been adept at circumventing barriers. Her fingers danced over the console as she navigated through layers of encryption, her heart racing with the thrill of trespass. The restricted files revealed more than she had hoped. Reports of unexplained phenomena dating back decades, sightings of beings with extraordinary abilities, and cryptic references to Project Veil. Celeste's breath caught as she scanned the files. The project appeared to be a clandestine initiative aimed at monitoring and containing the hidden society. The enforcers were not just protectors of Lamora. They were hunters. She downloaded everything she could onto the data module, her mind racing with implications. If the enforcers had been watching Kale's people for so long, then their discovery was not a matter of if, but when. And when that moment came, it would not end peacefully. That night, she returned to the Undercity, her movements deliberate and cautious. The weight of the data module in her pack felt heavier than it should, as if it carried not just information but the fate of two worlds. The journey to the hidden chamber felt longer this time, the shadows deeper, the silence more oppressive. Her heart pounded with every step, but she pressed on. When she reached the chamber, the atmosphere was tense. Kale and the others stood in a circle, their expressions grave. The veins of light in the walls pulsed faintly, as if echoing their unease. Kale's gaze snapped to her as she entered, their golden eyes narrowing. "You shouldn't have come back so soon," they said, their voice tinged with both relief and frustration. "It's too dangerous." "I know," Celeste replied, stepping forward, "but I found something. Something you need to see." She produced the data module, holding it out for Kale. The others exchanged wary glances, but Kale took it, their fingers brushing hers briefly. They inserted the module into a crystalline console, and the chamber's walls flickered, displaying the information she had stolen. The room fell silent as they absorbed the files. Images of surveillance drones, maps of subterranean networks, and records of previous encounters with beings like Kale scrolled across the glowing surfaces. The word containment appeared repeatedly, its implications chilling. "They've been hunting us all this time," the emerald-eyed figure said, their voice a low growl. "And now they're closer than ever," the warmth radiating figure added, their tone heavy with resignation. Kale turned to Celeste, their expression unreadable. "Why are you helping us?" they asked softly. "You have no reason to risk yourself for people you barely know." Celeste met their gaze, her voice steady. "Because I can't stand by and do nothing. Not when I know what they're planning. Not when I know what's at stake." Kale's eyes softened, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. "Then you've made your choice," they said. "But understand this, Celeste, there is no turning back. If you stand with us, you will share our fate." "I understand," she said, her voice unwavering. Kale nodded, their expression resolute. "Then let's begin. If the enforcers are coming, we need to be ready. And we'll need your help to survive what's to come." As the chamber's light intensified, Celeste felt a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in her life, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. Chapter 4. Threads of the Unseen. Celeste had never imagined her world would spiral into chaos so quickly. Just days ago, her life had been confined to the sterile corridors of the Stellar Research Complex, her only battles fought against equations and data sets. Now, she was in the midst of a war she could scarcely comprehend, standing shoulder to shoulder with beings who defied the laws of nature she had spent her life studying. The chamber pulsed with a restless energy as Kale and the others prepared. The crystalline console in the center of the room displayed maps, diagrams, and schematics, all projecting a grim reality. The enforcers were closing in. Their drones had been spotted in the peripheral tunnels, their scanners sweeping for any trace of the hidden society. Time was running out. Kale stood at the center of the room, their golden eyes fixed on the glowing maps. The other members of their group, Lyra, the warmth radiating figure, Soren, the stormy one with bluish skin, and Alaric, the sharp-eyed emerald figure, worked in tense silence, their movements quick and efficient. Celeste felt out of place amidst their practiced urgency, but she forced herself to focus. "What's our next move?" she asked, breaking the silence. Kale glanced at her, their expression unreadable. "We can't stay here. This chamber has remained hidden for centuries, but it's only a matter of time before the enforcers locate it. We need to move." "Move where?" Lyra interjected, her voice calm but firm. "Every known sanctuary has already been compromised. If we're forced into the open, it'll be the end of us." "Not necessarily," Celeste said, her mind racing. She stepped closer to the console, her fingers tracing the edges of the crystalline surface. "The enforcers are using predictive algorithms to track your movements, right? What if we fed them false data?" Soren frowned, his stormy gaze narrowing. "False data? You think we can trick them into looking in the wrong place?" "Exactly," Celeste replied, her confidence growing. "I can access their network, discreetly, of course, and insert a series of decoy signals. If done correctly, it could buy us enough time to relocate without detection." Kale's eyes met hers, a glimmer of hope mingled with caution. "You're certain you can do this?" "Certain enough," she said, "but I'll need access to a secure terminal. My equipment here won't cut it." "The old relay station," Alaric said suddenly, his voice sharp and precise. "It's deeper in the tunnels, past the aquifer. The enforcers haven't touched it in decades. It should still be operational." Kale nodded. "Then that's where we'll go. Gather what you need. We leave within the hour." The journey to the relay station was grueling. The tunnels twisted and turned, narrowing in places until they were forced to crawl. The air grew damp and heavy, the faint sound of rushing water echoing through the darkness. Celeste's legs burned with the effort, but she pressed on, driven by the urgency of their mission. Kale moved ahead, their presence a steadying force. They seemed to know the tunnels intimately, their steps confident even in the pitch black. Celeste followed closely, her pulse quickening whenever their fingers brushed hers as they helped her navigate the more treacherous sections. Finally, they emerged into a cavernous space. The relay station stood at its center, a hulking structure of rusted metal and cracked screens. It was a relic of an earlier era, its once gleaming surfaces now dulled by time and neglect. But to Celeste, it was perfect. "Give me a moment to set up," she said, pulling her equipment from her pack. The others fanned out, their eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. Kale lingered near her, their gaze steady. "You're taking a great risk for us," they said softly. "Why?" Celeste hesitated, her hands pausing over the console. The question had been gnawing at her, too. Why was she here, risking everything for a group of beings she barely knew? But when she looked at Kale, the answer seemed clearer. "Because I believe in you," she said finally. "I don't fully understand what you're fighting for, but I can see it's worth protecting." And she faltered, her cheeks warming. "And because I couldn't walk away from you." Kale's expression softened, a rare smile gracing their lips. "You're braver than you realize, Celeste." Her heart fluttered at their words, but she forced herself to focus. The console sprang to life under her touch, its ancient systems groaning in protest. She worked quickly, her fingers flying across the interface as she accessed the Enforcer's network. It was a labyrinth of firewalls and encrypted pathways, but she navigated it with practiced ease, her mind attuned to the rhythm of the code. Minutes stretched into hours as she worked, the others standing guard in tense silence. Finally, she leaned back, her shoulders aching but her task complete. "It's done," she said, exhaling a shaky breath. "The decoy signals are in place. They should keep the Enforcers occupied long enough for us to relocate." Kale placed a hand on her shoulder, their touch grounding. "You've done more than we could have hoped for." "Thank you." Before Celeste could respond, a distant rumble echoed through the cavern. The others tensed, their eyes darting to the shadows. "They found us," Soren said grimly. Kale's grip tightened on Celeste's shoulder. "We need to move. Now." The group sprang into action, their movements swift and coordinated. Celeste's heart pounded as they fled into the tunnels, the sound of approaching footsteps growing louder behind them. The Enforcers were close, too close, and the chase was just beginning. Chapter 5: Whispers in the Void. The tunnels were a labyrinth of twisting paths and sudden drops, their uneven surfaces slick with condensation. The echoes of boots against stone reverberated behind them, growing louder with each passing moment. Celeste ran as fast as her legs could carry her, her lungs burning with every labored breath. The dim light of Kale's energy halo illuminated their way, casting fleeting shadows on the walls that seemed to stretch and twist like grasping hands. "Faster!" Kale's voice cut through the pounding in her ears, firm yet calm. They led the group with unerring precision, their movements fluid and purposeful. "The Enforcers won't stop until they've cornered us." Behind her, Soren brought up the rear, his stormy features set in a grim mask. His hand rested on the hilt of a blade she hadn't seen before, its edge faintly crackling with an otherworldly light. "Keep moving," he growled, glancing over his shoulder. "I'll hold them off if I have to." "You'll do no such thing," Lyra countered, her warm glow flickering with barely concealed agitation. "We're not splitting up." "Not again." Celeste stumbled over a jagged rock, her footing momentarily lost. Kale caught her arm before she could fall, their touch steadying. "Are you all right?" they asked, their golden eyes meeting hers. "I'm fine," she panted, though her legs felt like lead. "Just don't let go." A small smile flickered across Kale's face despite the dire circumstances. "Never." Ahead, the tunnel split into 3 branches. Kale paused for the briefest of moments, their head tilting as they listened. The faint hum of the chamber's energy veins whispered through the rock, guiding them. "This way," they said, motioning to the leftmost passage. The air grew colder as they descended deeper into the earth. The sound of rushing water grew louder, mingling with the metallic clank of enforcer armor. Celeste's mind raced as she tried to estimate how much time their decoy signals had bought them. Not enough, clearly. The tunnel opened into a cavern dominated by an underground river. Its black waters churned violently, illuminated by the faint phosphorescence of algae clinging to the rocks. A narrow stone bridge spanned the river, its surface worn smooth by centuries of water and wind. "We'll cross here," Kale said, their voice low. "One at a time. The bridge won't hold all of us at once." "I'll go first," Soren volunteered, his tone leaving no room for argument. He stepped onto the bridge, his movements careful but unhesitating. The structure creaked ominously beneath his weight, but it held. One by one, they crossed. Celeste's heart thundered in her chest as she stepped onto the slick stone, her arms outstretched for balance. Kale was right behind her, their presence a reassuring warmth against the chill. As Lyra began her crossing, the distant sound of gunfire echoed through the tunnels. The enforcers had arrived. "Go, go, go!" Soren shouted, drawing his blade. The air around him crackled with energy as he positioned himself at the far end of the bridge, his stance braced for a fight. Kale's expression darkened. "We're out of time. Celeste, take this." They pressed a small crystal into her hand, its surface humming with latent energy. "If we get separated, keep moving. This will guide you to the safe zone. Do not stop for anything." "Separated?" Celeste's voice trembled. "What do you mean?" Kale's gaze softened, but there was no time for an answer. The first of the enforcers appeared at the mouth of the tunnel, their black armor gleaming in the faint light. "Move," Kale ordered, stepping forward to join Soren. Alaric and Lyra positioned themselves on either side of the bridge, their powers flaring to life. Lyra's radiance intensified, creating a barrier of heat that forced the enforcers to slow their advance. Alaric's emerald glow sharpened into crystalline shards, which he hurled with deadly precision. Celeste hesitated, torn between staying and obeying Kale's command. But as the enforcers opened fire, the decision was made for her. She clutched the crystal tightly and ran, the path ahead a blur of jagged rocks and shadowy twists. The sound of the battle faded as she pressed deeper into the tunnels, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. The crystal in her hand emitted a faint pulse, guiding her forward. Her mind was a whirlwind of fear and guilt. She had left them behind. Kale, Lyra, Soren, Alaric. They were fighting for her, risking everything, and she could do nothing but run. Tears stung her eyes as she stumbled into another cavern, this one smaller and quieter. The air was still, heavy with the scent of earth and stone. She sank to her knees, clutching the crystal as if it could somehow bring her comfort. "Celeste." The voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it sent a jolt through her. She turned to see Kale emerging from the shadows, their golden eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They were battered and bruised, their clothing torn, but they were alive. "Kale," she breathed, relief flooding her. She rushed to them, her arms wrapping around their shoulders. "You made it. Not alone," they said, their voice tinged with exhaustion. Behind them, Lyra and Alaric appeared, their expressions weary but determined. Soren was not with them. Celeste's heart sank. "Soren?" Kale's jaw tightened. "He's holding them off, giving us time. We have to go back for him," Celeste said, her voice breaking. "We can't," Kale said firmly. He knew what he was doing. "His sacrifice won't be in vain." Celeste's hands clenched into fists, her chest heaving with frustration and grief. But before she could argue further, the crystal in her hand flared brightly, its light casting long shadows across the cavern walls. "The safe zone is close," Kale said. "We need to keep moving." Despite the ache in her heart, Celeste nodded. Together, they pressed onward, the light of the crystal leading them into the unknown. Chapter 6. The Pulse of Forbidden Desire. The light from the crystal faded as they entered the safe zone, a cavern unlike any Celeste had seen before. It was vast, its ceiling stretching so high that it disappeared into darkness. The walls shimmered with bioluminescent moss, casting a soft, greenish glow that painted the cavern in an otherworldly light. Streams of crystalline water carved intricate paths across the ground, their gentle trickling the only sound in the otherwise hushed space. Kale's golden eyes scanned the area as they stepped forward, their expression unreadable. Lyra and Alaric trailed behind, their exhaustion evident in the way they moved. Celeste's gaze flickered back toward the tunnel they'd emerged from, half expecting the enforcers to appear at any moment. But the cavern remained still, its silence unnerving. "Is this it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The safe zone?" Kale nodded. "For now. The enforcers won't find us here, but we can't stay too long." "Why not?" Celeste pressed, frowning. "If they can't find us, wouldn't this be the safest place?" Kale hesitated, glancing toward Lyra and Alaric. The two exchanged a weighted look before Kale spoke. "This place, it's not entirely stable. It's connected to the energy veins that run through the hidden world. If we linger too long, we risk disruptions." "Disruptions?" Celeste repeated, a sinking feeling in her stomach. Alaric's voice cut in, sharp and pragmatic. "The veins aren't just sources of power. They're alive in a sense, and they react to prolonged disturbances. Too much energy drawn here could attract unwanted attention." "Unwanted attention," Celeste muttered, shaking her head. "Of course." Kale placed a hand on her shoulder, their touch grounding. "We'll explain everything once we've regrouped and rested. For now, we need to secure the perimeter and assess our supplies." While Kale and Alaric set to work examining the cavern's edges for vulnerabilities, Celeste sat beside Lyra near one of the glowing streams. Lyra's radiance had dimmed, her usually vibrant light now a faint flicker. She leaned against the cavern wall, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Are you okay?" Celeste asked, studying her companion's weary face. Lyra offered a small, strained smile. "I've been better. Using my powers so extensively takes a toll. I'll recover, though. Don't worry about me." "How can I not worry?" Celeste countered. "You're all putting yourselves at risk because of me." Lyra's expression softened, and she reached out to take Celeste's hand. "We're in this together. You may feel like an outsider, but you're one of us now." "That's what Kale believes, and I trust them." Celeste's chest tightened at the mention of Kale. She glanced toward them, watching as they worked with focused determination. "Kale is incredible," she murmured. "How do they always know what to do?" Lyra's smile grew, genuine this time. "Kale carries more weight than they let on. They've been a guiding light for all of us, even when they're struggling themselves. But don't be fooled. They're only human, just like the rest of us." Celeste nodded, her mind swirling with thoughts of Kale's quiet strength and unwavering resolve. It was both comforting and intimidating. Hours passed, though time felt distorted within the cavern's timeless stillness. Kale eventually called them all together, their expression grave. "We've assessed the situation," they began, their voice echoing softly. "The cavern's energy is stable for now, but we can't afford to stay more than a day. The enforcers are likely regrouping, and it's only a matter of time before they're back on our trail." "So what's the plan?" Lyra asked, her tone steady despite her weariness. Kale hesitated for the first time. their gaze flickering to Celeste. "We need to split up." The words hung heavy in the air, met with immediate protests. Lyra shook her head vehemently. Alaric's jaw tightened, and Celeste's heart dropped. "No," Lyra said firmly. "We've already lost Soren. We can't divide ourselves further." Kale raised a hand, their expression pained but resolute. "I don't like it either, but it's our best chance. The enforcers are tracking us as a group. If we split, they'll be forced to divide their forces, giving us a better chance of evasion." "And where exactly are we supposed to go?" Alaric demanded, his voice laced with frustration. Kale pointed to the crystal Celeste still held. "Celeste and I will take the primary route to the surface. We'll draw their attention. Lyra and Alaric, you'll take the secondary path to the sanctuary at the Western Fissure. Once there, you'll rendezvous with the others and plan your next move." "You're using yourselves as bait," Lyra said, her voice trembling. "That's reckless, even for you." Kale's gaze softened. "It's the only way. If we don't lead them away, none of us will make it." Silence fell over the group as the weight of the decision settled. Finally, Lyra nodded, though tears glistened in her eyes. "Fine. But you'd better make it back to us, Kale." Kale smiled faintly. "That's the plan." The group shared a quiet meal, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken fears. When it was time to part, Celeste found herself standing alone with Kale at the mouth of their chosen tunnel. She hesitated, the words she wanted to say caught in her throat. "You don't have to come with me," Kale said gently, breaking the silence. "I won't force you into more danger." Celeste shook her head. "I'm not leaving you. We're in this together, remember?" Kale's expression softened, a flicker of relief crossing their features. Together, then, as they stepped into the darkness, the weight of the unknown pressed against them. But side by side, they moved forward, their resolve unshaken. Somewhere ahead lay danger and uncertainty, but also the faint glimmer of hope, a hope forged in darkness. Chapter 7. A World Apart. The tunnel stretched endlessly before them, its walls narrowing as the silence grew heavier. Celeste could hear the soft echo of their footsteps against the rocky floor, a steady rhythm that did little to quell her unease. Beside her, Kale moved with purpose, their golden eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The air was thick with tension, but Celeste couldn't tell if it was the weight of the journey ahead or the proximity of the enforcers that haunted them both. "How far does this go?" she asked, her voice a low murmur. Kale glanced over their shoulder, their expression unreadable. "Far enough to give us a head start. These tunnels connect to an old network of passageways. They were used centuries ago by my people to evade detection. Most humans don't even know they exist." "Most humans don't know your world exists," Celeste said, half to herself. Kale's lips quirked into a brief, bittersweet smile. "Precisely." They walked on in silence for a time, the only sounds the occasional drip of water and the distant hum of energy emanating from the crystalline veins embedded in the walls. Celeste's thoughts swirled with questions she hadn't dared to ask before. How long had Kale lived like this, hiding in the shadows? And why did they choose to risk everything for her? Finally, she broke the silence. "What do you think will happen when we reach the surface?" Kale slowed, their gaze thoughtful. "It depends. If the enforcers catch up to us before we can find shelter, we'll have to fight. But if we make it to the rendezvous point in time, we might have a chance to regroup and plan our next move. And if we don't?" Kale hesitated, their jaw tightening. "Then we'll find another way." Celeste nodded, though her chest tightened at the uncertainty in their voice. Hours later, the tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber. Stalactites hung like jagged teeth from the ceiling, while phosphorescent fungi bathed the space in a pale, ghostly light. In the center of the chamber stood a massive obelisk, its surface covered in intricate runes that pulsed faintly with energy. Celeste felt an inexplicable pull toward it, as if the stone itself were calling to her. Kale's hand shot out, gripping her arm. "Don't touch it." She turned to them, startled. "Why? What is it?" "A relic of the old world," Kale explained, their tone grave. "It's a conduit for the veil, the barrier that separates our world from yours. Touching it without the proper attunement could, well, it wouldn't end well." Celeste took a cautious step back, her curiosity tempered by Kale's warning. "Have you ever used it?" Kale's gaze lingered on the obelisk for a moment before they shook their head. "No, only the elders possess the knowledge to wield its power. The rest of us are forbidden from even approaching it." "Then why is it here?" Celeste asked, frowning. "It's a marker," Kale said simply. "A reminder of the boundaries we must not cross." Celeste couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the obelisk than Kale was letting on, but she chose not to press further. There were enough mysteries in this world without adding another to the list. As they prepared to leave the chamber, a faint tremor rippled through the ground. Celeste froze, her heart pounding as small rocks tumbled from the walls. "What was that?" she whispered. Kale's eyes narrowed, their posture tense. "We're not alone." The words had barely left their lips when a deafening roar echoed through the chamber. Celeste spun around just in time to see a massive creature emerge from the shadows. Its body was covered in jagged, obsidian-like scales that shimmered in the dim light, and its eyes glowed with a fiery intensity. It moved with a predator's grace, each step sending shockwaves through the ground. "Stay behind me," Kale ordered, drawing a slender blade from their belt. The weapon pulsed with the same eerie energy as the obelisk, its edge gleaming with an otherworldly light. "What is that thing?" Celeste asked, her voice trembling. "A guardian," Kale said grimly. "It's meant to protect the veil from intruders." "But we're not intruders," Celeste protested. "The guardians don't differentiate," Kale replied. "To them, anyone who enters this space is a threat." The creature let out another roar and lunged toward them. Kale moved with inhuman speed, their blade flashing as they met the attack head-on. Sparks flew as metal clashed against scale, the sound reverberating through the chamber. Celeste watched in awe and terror as Kale fought with a ferocity she hadn't known they possessed. But the Guardian was relentless. It struck with brutal force, its claws tearing through the air inches from Kale's head. Celeste's instinct screamed at her to run, but she couldn't leave Kale to face the creature alone. Summoning every ounce of courage, she grabbed a jagged rock from the ground and hurled it at the Guardian. The projectile struck the creature's flank, drawing its attention. It turned towards Celeste, its fiery eyes locking onto her. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then, with a guttural snarl, it charged. "Celeste, no!" Kale shouted, their voice laced with panic. But before the creature could reach her, a sudden burst of light erupted from the obelisk. The chamber was flooded with brilliance, and the Guardian halted mid-charge, its roar turning into a pained howl. Celeste shielded her eyes, the intensity of the light overwhelming. When it finally faded, the Guardian was gone, leaving behind only the faint smell of sulfur. Celeste turned to Kale, her chest heaving. What just happened? Kale's expression was a mix of relief and apprehension. The obelisk intervened. "It must have sensed your presence." "Why would it do that?" Celeste asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kale's gaze softened, but their answer was laced with uncertainty. "I don't know, but whatever the reason, we need to move. The energy it released will have alerted anyone nearby." Celeste nodded, her legs trembling as they made their way out of the chamber. The encounter had left her shaken, but one thing was clear. The mysteries of this world were far deeper than she'd ever imagined, and the further they ventured, the more dangerous those mysteries became. Chapter 8. Between the Stars and the Abyss. The tension in the air had thickened over the last few days, palpable and suffocating. Each time Eileen and Vero met, it felt like the world was on the brink of collapse, held together only by the fragile threads of their love. In their eyes, the spark was still there, the silent promise they made in the quiet moments of shared gazes and whispered words. But reality, as it often did, was pulling them apart with a force neither could resist. Eileen stood by the window of her small laboratory, her eyes tracing the thin line between the glowing cityscape and the sprawling wilderness beyond. The city was quiet tonight, as it often was when the sun dipped beneath the horizon, leaving behind the dull hum of machinery and the soft buzz of energy fields that stretched across the sky. But despite the stillness, the weight of the impending decision loomed over her like an unstoppable storm. Her mind was filled with fragments of Vero's words, the coldness of his tone when he said he couldn't continue their secret meetings, the fight they had, a heated exchange of accusations and fears, replayed in her mind like a broken record. She could still hear the bitterness in his voice, the doubt that had crept in when the risks they were taking became too great. "You don't understand, Eileen. If they find out about us, it's not just our lives at stake. The entire future of the society could be jeopardized. You can't play with that." He had tried to explain, tried to make her understand the impossible choices that lay before them. But what was it all for? She had wondered. What was the point of the endless barriers, the lies, the silences, if not for their love? She turned her back on the window and ran a hand through her hair, frustrated. The answers weren't coming, and the more she thought about their world, the more hopeless it seemed. In her heart, she knew that the stakes were higher than either of them had ever imagined. But at what cost? Could they really survive the growing divide between their worlds? Or was their love doomed to fade like everything else that dared to challenge the structure of society? The door to the lab creaked open, and she didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Vero's presence filled the room like a storm cloud, silent but ever so powerful. He had come to speak again, and this time, Eileen felt something shift in the air between them. It wasn't the tender love they had once shared, the connection that had seemed so unbreakable. No, now there was only an aching, painful awareness of what they could never be. "You were right, you know," Eileen whispered, her voice barely audible as she faced him. "We were foolish. I should have known the risks, but I didn't want to face the truth." Vero stepped closer, his footsteps heavy against the cold floor. "Eileen," his voice faltered for a moment, a sharp contrast to the usual calmness. "We don't have time for regret. You have to understand, we're out of time." The desperation in his eyes mirrored her own, and for a brief moment, the world outside their fragile bubble ceased to exist. They were just two souls, torn between love and survival, unwilling to let go even as the weight of their choices grew unbearable. "But what do we do now?" Eileen asked, her voice breaking with emotion. "How can we keep going when everything is falling apart around us?" He reached out to her, but for a moment, Eileen hesitated. The touch that once comforted her now felt like an unbearable reminder of what was slipping through their fingers. Finally, her resolve crumbled, and she stepped into his embrace, burying her face in his chest. "I don't know what the future holds," Vero said softly, his hand running through her hair. "But I know this, no matter what happens, I'll be with you. I'll always be with you." The words were supposed to offer her comfort, but instead, they only deepened the ache in her chest. How could they ever be together when the world around them was so determined to tear them apart? And then it happened. An explosion, a bright flash of light that tore through the sky and shook the very foundations of the lab. Eileen gasped, pulling away from Vero as the room shuddered around them. Outside, the sound of alarms blared, and the distant thrum of emergency drones signaled the beginning of something much larger than the personal struggles they faced. "They found us," Vero said, his voice low and tense. His eyes locked with hers, a realization dawning on them both. Eileen's heart pounded in her chest. "We have to go. Now." She grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the exit, adrenaline coursing through her veins. But even as she ran, she couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that their love, this fragile bond they had fought so hard to protect, was no longer enough. The time for quiet revolutions, for whispered promises in the dark, was over. The war had already begun, and they were caught in its destructive wake. The city outside was chaos, lights flashing in every direction as distant explosions rocked the streets. People screamed, running for shelter as a new kind of war unfolded. It wasn't just the humans and the hidden society anymore. It was something darker, something that neither of them had anticipated. The forces that sought to destroy everything they had fought for, everything they had hoped for. Vero's grip on her hand tightened, pulling her toward the shadows of the alleyways where they could hide. But there was no hiding from this. Eileen could feel it in her bones. The world was about to change, and nothing, not even their love, could stop it. They ducked into the darkness of an old underground passage, breathing heavily from the exertion. Eileen's mind raced, every thought and feeling colliding within her. She wanted to cry out, to scream at the injustice of it all, but the words didn't come. There were no answers, only more questions. "How did they find us?" she asked, her voice trembling. Vero's expression hardened. "It doesn't matter. What matters now is that we survive." Eileen nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed the words. The weight of the world had settled heavily on her shoulders. They were no longer just running from society's rules. They were running from a future that seemed to promise nothing but pain and separation. For the first time, Eileen realized the full scope of what they were up against. It wasn't just about their love anymore. It was about survival, and she wasn't sure if she had the strength to keep fighting. But as Vero pulled her deeper into the shadows, she understood one thing. No matter what happened, she would face it by his side. The storm had arrived, and it was up to them to weather it together. Chapter 9. Fractured Truths. The underground passage was cold, its stone walls damp and silent, save for the soft echo of their footsteps. Eileen's breath came in short, rapid bursts, each exhale clouding the air before dissipating. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind a hollow ache deep in her chest. She could feel it, the separation between her and Vero, the distance that had crept in the moment they stepped into the shadows. The world outside was chaos, and no matter how tightly she held onto him, she couldn't shake the feeling that the chaos was following them, ready to pull them apart. Vero had been quiet since they ran, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a tautness that mirrored the tension in her own body. They moved through the winding tunnels in silence, their footsteps the only sound that kept them tethered to the present. Eileen kept her eyes on the ground, not wanting to look at him just yet. What could she say? What words could bridge the vast distance that had formed between them since the explosion, the breach of their fragile sanctuary? They paused in a small, dimly lit alcove at the edge of the passage, the weight of their silence pressing down on them like an unbearable force. Vero leaned against the wall, his hand gripping the rough stone as if it might anchor him to something stable in a world that was spinning out of control. Eileen could see the strain in his face, the way his jaw clenched with each passing second. "We need to move fast," he said, his voice low, a thread of urgency weaving through the words. "The longer we stay here, the closer they'll get." Eileen nodded, but her heart wasn't in it. She was thinking of something else. The explosion, the warning shots that had shattered the fragile piece of their lives. Everything was collapsing, and she didn't know how to hold on anymore. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, as if speaking louder would make the weight of their situation even heavier. Vero's eyes darkened, and for the briefest moment, Eileen saw the exhaustion that lingered behind the steely resolve he usually wore like armor. He turned to face her fully, the gravity of the situation now more evident than ever. "We fight," he said simply, though his tone was anything but certain. "We have to. There's no going back now." Eileen felt her heart race at his words, but it wasn't excitement. It was fear. Fear of losing everything. She had known from the moment they met that their love was dangerous. But now, with the world closing in on them, it felt like a reckless gamble they could never win. "I don't know if I can do this, Vero," she confessed, her voice cracking. "What if we fail? What if this war destroys everything we've built?" He stepped closer, his presence a constant, unyielding force in her life. But even as his hand reached for hers, something in the air between them shifted. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before his fingers curled around hers, but his grip was different, tentative, uncertain. It wasn't the comforting strength she was used to. It was as if he was holding on to her just as desperately as she was holding on to him, but neither of them had any idea how long they could keep their grip tight before it slipped away entirely. "We don't have a choice, Eileen," Vero replied, his voice hardening with determination. "If we run now, it's over. For both of us, for everyone. We've already crossed the line. We either stand and fight, or we're consumed by this." Eileen wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that standing together, fighting back against the forces that threatened to tear them apart, was the right choice. But the reality of what that would mean, the pain, the bloodshed, the sacrifices they would both have to make, was almost too much to bear. "I'm scared," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "What if we're not strong enough? What if we're just two people caught in something we can't control?" Vero's expression softened, his features marked by the weight of his own fears, ones he had never shown her before. "I'm scared too, Eileen, every day. But I know this much. I won't let you face it alone. Not now, not ever." She searched his eyes for the truth, for any sign that he, too, was questioning everything. But there was nothing. Only the same fierce resolve that had kept him fighting all these years. Eileen didn't know if she could match that intensity, but she didn't have a choice. Not anymore. The quiet hum of the city above them seemed miles away, the distant glow of its skyline barely a memory now that they had stepped beyond its reach. They were in a different world now, a world where their love was no longer a secret, where every choice they made carried the weight of the future. The past, her life as a scientist, his as a protector of the hidden society, felt like an illusion. In the space between then and now, only the present existed. Only their love, fragile as it was, could anchor them to anything resembling hope. But hope was a dangerous thing. It could fuel rebellion, yes, but it could also destroy everything in its wake. Eileen pulled her hand from Vero's, her gaze dropping to the floor as she tried to steady herself. "I don't know if I can be strong for both of us. What if I fail you?" Vero's face hardened, and his voice became steely once again, as if he were trying to suppress his own doubts. "Then we'll fall together. I'd rather fall by your side than live without you." Her heart tightened at his words, a tear slipping down her cheek before she could stop it. The rawness of the situation hit her all at once. There was no easy answer, no clear path forward. Only the darkness ahead and the fleeting chance of survival. Eileen wiped her eyes and drew in a shaky breath, trying to regain some semblance of composure. The next steps were uncertain, the road ahead treacherous. The war between their worlds had begun, and no matter how much they wanted to hold on to their love, the harsh truth was undeniable. They would have to make choices, sacrifice parts of themselves, and risk everything. There was no going back. Then we fight, Eileen said, her voice steadier than she felt. She met Vero's gaze, the spark of determination igniting once more. Together, Vero nodded, his jaw tight with resolve. Together, and in that moment, Eileen realized that the only thing that mattered, the only thing they had left to cling to, was each other. The world was changing, and they were caught in the storm. But no matter what came, they would face it side by side. The divide between their worlds was vast, but their love could still bridge it for now. Chapter 10. The Weight of Secrets. The darkness of the underground tunnels seemed to stretch endlessly, as if the world itself had been swallowed whole. Eileen could feel the weight of it pressing down on her chest. Each step they took further into the unknown only amplifying the sense of helplessness that had taken root in her heart. They had been moving for hours, but the oppressive silence that hung around them was deafening. Every echo of their footsteps seemed like a warning, a reminder that they were no longer just running from the authorities or the world that sought to tear them apart. They were running from something far deeper, far more dangerous. The realization that their love could never truly escape the shadows. Vero moved ahead of her, his figure a dark silhouette against the faint light that trickled down from the overhead vents. His body was tense, every muscle taut as if he were preparing for something, for anything that might threaten their fragile escape. Eileen's mind was elsewhere, though, on the decisions they had yet to make and the ones that would shape the course of their lives forever. The time for hesitation was long past. There was no turning back now. They had no plan, no strategy, only the knowledge that the city above, their former lives, were slipping further and further out of reach. The rebellion was no longer an abstract threat. It was a reality they were about to face head-on. Eileen had never imagined that she would be part of something so much bigger than herself. And yet, here she was, standing at the precipice of a war that would define the future of two worlds, the human world and the hidden society that had always existed in the shadows. She glanced at Vero as he turned a corner ahead, his movements smooth but purposeful. She wanted to ask him where they were going, but the question felt irrelevant. Where they went no longer mattered. It was what they did when they got there that would determine their fate. As she rounded the corner to join him, her breath caught in her throat. Before them, the tunnel opened up into a massive underground chamber, the walls lined with ancient carvings and flickering lights. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. A place that seemed both alive and ancient, as if it had been waiting for them, for this moment. It was the heart of the hidden society, a sanctuary of sorts, but one that no outsider had ever seen. This, Eileen realized, was the true center of the rebellion. Vero stopped just inside the chamber, his back to her as he took in the space with a familiarity that left her breathless. She stepped forward, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. There were no windows, no clear doors, only passageways leading deeper into the complex. But there were signs of life here. People moving in the shadows, whispering in low voices, preparing for something. Eileen could feel the undercurrent of tension in the air, a low hum of anticipation that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. "Vero?" Eileen asked, her voice barely above a whisper, yet loud enough to draw his attention. "What is this place?" He turned to face her, his eyes hard, his expression unreadable. "This is where it begins." Eileen swallowed, the weight of his words settling over her. She had known that there would be no easy path forward, but seeing the rebellion's true heart made it all too real. She was no longer just a scientist trying to protect a fragile secret. She was now a part of something far larger. A movement that sought to overthrow the very system that had controlled their lives for so long. Vero reached out, grasping her hand in his with a fierceness that surprised her. "I know you're scared," he said, his voice low and steady, "but this is the only way. We can't keep running forever. Eileen's eyes searched his face, looking for some hint of the man she had fallen in love with. The calm, thoughtful Vero she had known was still there, but something had changed. He was no longer just her protector. He was a leader now, caught between the man he had been and the leader he was becoming. The burden of the rebellion weighed heavily on him, and she could see the strain in his every movement. "What do we do?" she asked, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Vero looked down at their joined hands, his fingers tightening around hers. For a moment, there was silence, a moment where they were just two people in love, standing in the midst of a war they could neither control nor escape. "I can't promise you that this will be easy," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "But I can promise you this. We fight, and we fight together." Eileen's chest tightened as she nodded, the words settling into her heart like a promise. She had never been one to shy away from a challenge, but this was different. This was no longer about the pursuit of knowledge or the desire to protect a world she loved. This was about survival, and survival meant sacrifice. The rebel camp was a flurry of activity. Eileen was quickly introduced to the key players, people she had only heard of in whispers. There were fighters, strategists, and those who had been in hiding for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. They were all determined, their faces grim with the knowledge that the road ahead would not be easy. Yet in their eyes, Eileen saw something she hadn't seen before: hope. It was strange to see it here, in a place so filled with darkness and uncertainty. Hope was a dangerous thing in a world like theirs. It was a beacon that could easily be snuffed out, and Eileen wasn't sure if it was something she could trust. But as the hours passed and the plans for the next phase of the rebellion began to take shape, she couldn't help but feel a spark of something deep inside her. Maybe it was hope, too. She spent the next few days preparing, learning the intricacies of the rebellion's inner workings and understanding the risks that would come with their next move. Vero was by her side, always watching, always planning. She could see the toll it was taking on him, but he refused to let it show. In some ways, he seemed more determined than ever, as though he had already accepted the price they would have to pay for their fight. And yet, despite everything, despite the looming danger and the uncertainty of their future, Eileen couldn't help but feel a pull toward him, a pull that was both familiar and terrifying. They had crossed a line together, one that they could never uncross. And now, there was no turning back. They were on the brink of war, and the cost would be steep. But as Eileen stood beside Vero, feeling his hand tighten around hers once more, she realized that whatever happened next, whatever sacrifices they would be forced to make, they would face it together. The world might have changed, but their love, this love forged in darkness, was the one thing that remained certain. The rebellion had begun, and there was no going back. Chapter 11: Chains of the Heart. The rebellion had begun in earnest. Eileen couldn't remember when the last quiet moment had been, when she could simply exist without the gnawing urgency, the constant pressure of the impending conflict hanging over her every action. The days blurred together in a haze of preparation and brief moments of solitude, where the weight of her new reality would press against her chest like an unrelenting storm. Vero had been a constant, but he, too, was changing. The calm, analytical man she had once known seemed more distant now, his mind forever occupied with the war that was unfolding. She could feel the tension in his every movement, the sharpness in his eyes as he gave orders, as he strategized with the rebel leaders. It wasn't just the war that had changed him. It was the burden of knowing that the consequences of their choices would ripple across both their worlds. Eileen understood it. She knew that this was what he had been prepared for all his life. This was his fight, his cause. But it didn't make it any easier to watch him slowly transform into someone else, someone she could no longer reach. They had spent days in the heart of the underground rebel complex, gathering supplies, forging alliances, and planning the first strike against the government forces that sought to crush them. It was a plan that had been months in the making, the culmination of years of hidden resistance, but it had never felt more real. They were about to face the very force that had governed their lives for as long as they could remember. Today, they would strike. Eileen stood in the dimly lit strategy room, surrounded by figures she barely knew, their faces grim with determination. The air was thick with the scent of fear and resolve, the tension palpable as the final pieces of their plan fell into place. The target was a government facility, a communications center that had been the backbone of their surveillance network. Destroying it would cripple their ability to track the movement of the rebellion and send a message to those who had underestimated the power of the hidden society. But Eileen knew that it was more than just a tactical strike. It was a declaration of war, a statement that they would no longer cower in the shadows, that they were willing to pay the price to reclaim their freedom. Vero stood at the head of the room, his presence commanding the attention of everyone around him. His gaze swept over the group, his face impassive, but there was a fire in his eyes, one that burned with the same intensity that had driven him to this moment. He didn't need to say much. His actions spoke for him, his reputation among the rebels preceding him. Eileen couldn't help but watch him. It was impossible not to. In the chaos of the rebellion, in the weight of their shared mission, she had lost track of the man she had once known. She longed for the quiet moments when they had been just Eileen and Vero, before all of this, before the war. But those moments were gone now, swept away by the tide of history. Her thoughts were interrupted by Vero's voice, cutting through the haze of uncertainty that had settled over her. "We move in an hour," he said, his tone crisp, efficient. "Once we strike, there will be no turning back. We'll be marked as enemies of the state. The government will come after us with everything they have." Eileen's heart skipped a beat at the words. There had been no illusions about the consequences of their actions, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way nothing else could. The road ahead was a dangerous one, filled with uncertainty and loss. Yet, despite the fear that bubbled in her chest, there was a part of her, something deep inside, that couldn't help but feel alive. This was it. This was their fight. Vero continued, his gaze sweeping over the room one last time. "We hit them hard, we hit them fast, and we do it together. No one is left behind." The rebellion had always been a collective effort, but now, more than ever, it felt like a single, unified force, a force that would change the course of history. Eileen wasn't just a scientist anymore. She wasn't just someone with knowledge to offer. She was a part of something much bigger, a cog in the machinery of a revolution that could either free them or destroy them. As Vero dismissed the room, Eileen remained seated, her mind racing. The quiet hum of the underground facility seemed to thrum in her chest, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the first strike. The rebel leaders moved quickly to finalize preparations, their faces a mix of anticipation and grim determination. But Eileen couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, something crucial that she couldn't put her finger on. It wasn't until Vero reappeared, standing in the doorway, that she realized what it was. He hadn't looked at her once during the briefing. He hadn't sought her out, as he once would have. There was no question in his mind that she would follow him into battle, that they would fight together. But the distance between them had grown, and it hurt in ways she hadn't expected. She had seen it in his eyes earlier, the burden of leadership. But now, standing before him, she saw something else, something darker. He was closing himself off, protecting something that he couldn't, or wouldn't, share with her. He met her gaze for the first time, his expression unreadable. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice soft but laced with the weight of everything they had to lose. Eileen nodded, trying to steady her breath. "I'm ready," but the words felt hollow. How could she be ready for this? How could anyone be ready to face the unknown, to put everything they had on the line and risk it all for a cause that was as uncertain as the future itself? Vero didn't seem to notice her hesitation. His eyes softened for a fraction of a second, but then the moment passed, and his gaze hardened once more. He stepped aside, making way for her to join the others. They walked together in silence toward the staging area, the weight of the moment settling over them like a suffocating cloak. The sounds of the rebellion's preparations were muffled in the distance, but Eileen could hear her heart pounding in her ears, each beat a reminder of the risk they were about to take. There was no turning back from this, no retreat. Once the strike was made, there would be no more hiding, no more safe places to run. They were stepping into the fire now. Vero's hand brushed hers as they moved through the narrow passageways, a fleeting touch that sent a spark of warmth through her veins. But it wasn't enough. It never was anymore. As they neared the exit, Eileen's mind raced, and her stomach twisted with a mixture of fear and resolve. This was the first step in a long journey, a journey that could end in victory or ruin. And whatever the outcome, she knew one thing with certainty: nothing would ever be the same again. The rebellion had chosen their moment, and the moment had come. The first strike had been made. Now, all they could do was wait to see how the world would respond. Chapter 12. A Storm Between Us. The world held its breath. Eileen could feel it in the air. The tense, electric stillness that followed the explosion. The ground had trembled beneath their feet, the shockwave of their first strike rippling through the dark streets above them. It had been swift, the blast obliterating the communications center in seconds. But now, as the dust settled, Eileen couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was just beginning. The underground rebel complex was a flurry of activity. People were moving quickly, preparing for the fallout, but no one spoke. The silence was deafening in its weight, broken only by the muted sounds of footsteps and the occasional murmur of command. Eileen stood in the corner of the war room, her hands clenched at her sides, her heart pounding in her chest. They had struck hard, but now, as she looked around the room at the faces of the rebels, she saw fear in their eyes. This was no longer a simple act of rebellion. It was a declaration of war. Vero had been at the center of the strategy, his mind calculating every move, anticipating every possible outcome. But even he seemed to sense the shift in the air. His face, usually so calm, was drawn, a shadow of doubt flickering behind his eyes. He had always been certain, always so sure of the cause. But now, the cost of their actions was becoming more clear. There was no way of knowing how the government would retaliate, how far they would go to crush the rebellion. They had just taken a life-changing risk, and the consequences could be dire. Eileen's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the situation. She had always been a scientist, a woman of logic and reason. But the rebellion was a world where emotions and decisions didn't follow predictable patterns. This was no longer a matter of discovery or calculation. This was survival. And survival meant making choices that had no clear right or wrong. She turned to face Vero, who had been in constant communication with the leaders of the other cells, coordinating the next phase of their operation. He didn't look at her when she approached. He was focused on the task at hand, his fingers moving swiftly over the holographic maps projected in front of him. Eileen had always admired his calm demeanor, his ability to make decisions without hesitation. But now she saw the cracks in the facade. He was no longer the man she had once known. He was something else now. A leader, yes, but also someone who carried the weight of 1,000 lives on his shoulders. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure of what to say. What could she say? The world had changed, and so had they. Vero, she began softly, but he didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the display in front of him. She took a deep breath, pushing aside the worry that clenched her stomach. She had to speak up. She had to understand what came next. "Vero, what happens now?" she asked, her voice more steady than she felt. "How do we move forward from here?" Finally, he looked at her. His gaze was intense, but there was something in it, something that made her heart tighten. It was exhaustion, a deep, gnawing weariness that had settled into his bones. He had always carried the weight of their cause, but now it seemed to be crushing him. "We prepare for the next strike," he said, his voice low, almost too calm. "We don't stop. Not now." Eileen searched his face, trying to read the emotions that flickered behind his eyes. "And if the government retaliates? What if they will retaliate," Vero interrupted, his voice sharper than before. "We've crossed a line. They won't let this go." He paused, his expression darkening. "But we don't have the luxury of hesitation. The longer we wait, the more lives we lose." Eileen swallowed, the weight of his words sinking into her chest. There was no turning back. There was no safe place anymore. Not for any of them. "I understand," she said, though the words felt hollow. Vero didn't seem to hear her. He was already turning back to the holographic map, already lost in the war that was unfolding before them. She knew him well enough to see that his mind was 1,000 miles away, already strategizing the next move, already planning the next attack. But there was no warmth in the way he spoke to her, no acknowledgement of the connection they had once shared. There was only the cold determination of a man who had become something else. Eileen felt a pang of loneliness deep in her chest. She had thought that their love, their bond, would be enough to carry them through the darkest times. But now, as the rebellion gained momentum, she wondered if she had been wrong. The war had changed everything, and she was afraid that in the process, it was changing them too. Hours passed in a blur. The rebel leaders continued to strategize, coordinating with the other cells scattered across the city. They had dealt the government a blow, but it was just the beginning. Eileen spent the time poring over the intelligence reports, trying to make sense of the government's next move. The situation was becoming more dangerous by the minute. They had hit them where it hurt, but now, the retaliation was inevitable. There was no telling how much they had stirred up with that first strike. The city was on edge, the government forces already mobilizing, preparing to bring down the full weight of their power on the rebels. Eileen tried to focus, tried to push aside the fear that threatened to consume her. But it was difficult. The closer they got to their next move, the more the weight of it all pressed on her shoulders. There was no end in sight, no guarantee of survival, no promise that they would ever see the light of day again. And through it all, Vero remained distant, lost in his own world. She could see it now, how the burden of leadership had eroded the man she had once known. His decisions, though necessary, were made without hesitation, without the compassion that had once defined him. She knew he was doing what he thought was right, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he had lost something in the process. As night fell over the city, the air grew heavy with anticipation. The first strike had been made, but the true battle had yet to begin. And as Eileen stood in the midst of the rebels, surrounded by faces both familiar and unknown, she couldn't help but wonder if they were ready for the storm that was coming. The future was uncertain, the path ahead fraught with danger. But one thing was clear: the rebellion had begun, and there was no turning back. Chapter 13: The Edge of Sacrifice. Eileen had never truly understood the meaning of sacrifice until that night. The rebellion was not what she had imagined. The grandeur of their mission, the excitement of resistance, had all but faded into something unrecognizable. It had become a weight, heavy, suffocating, and relentless. The first strike had been a victory, but with it came the harsh reality of what it meant to fight, to risk everything, to be willing to lose everything. The government responded with force, their retaliation swift and brutal. Within hours of the explosion, government forces had flooded the city, tightening their grip, systematically dismantling any rebel strongholds they could find. The streets were no longer safe. The city had turned into a war zone. News of the government's crackdown spread quickly, and in the midst of the chaos, it became clear that the rebellion's first victory had come at a terrible cost. Eileen sat in the dimly lit medical bay of the underground complex, her fingers trembling as she stared at the blood-stained bandages in her hands. The room reeked of antiseptic and sweat, the air thick with the sound of labored breathing. Rebel fighters lay on makeshift beds, their faces pale, their bodies battered. The familiar faces of those who had been with her from the beginning were now marked by the brutality of war. She had seen death before in her studies, but this was different. This was real. This was personal. She had been the one to patch up their wounds, to try and bring a sense of normalcy to the chaos. But there was nothing normal about what was happening. Nothing could prepare her for the feeling of helplessness that washed over her every time a new casualty was brought in. Every scream, every breath of agony was a reminder of how fragile they all were, how fragile the rebellion was. But the hardest part of it all, the part that kept her awake at night, was the one she could not escape. The distance that had formed between her and Vero. It had started subtly at first, a quiet withdrawal, but now it was undeniable. He was no longer the man who had once whispered sweet words in the quiet corners of their world. He was a leader, consumed by the demands of the war. His eyes, once filled with tenderness, were now hard with determination. And though he still made decisions for the rebellion, though he still fought by her side, Eileen felt the gap between them widening with every passing day. They hadn't spoken much since the strike. Vero had become a ghost, flitting in and out of their rebel hideouts, overseeing the next steps of their campaign. He no longer sought her out like he used to. His presence was a cold, distant thing. And though Eileen knew he was still there, still fighting, she couldn't reach him. Not anymore. She rubbed her eyes, trying to stave off the tears that threatened to spill. She wasn't sure whether they were for the people who had been lost in the strike, or for herself, for the parts of her soul that were slowly being worn away by the unrelenting storm. The rebellion was taking more from her than she had ever expected. Footsteps echoed through the hallway outside, pulling her from her thoughts. Eileen stood, her legs shaky beneath her, and moved toward the door. She didn't need to look to know who it was. She knew that walk all too well. Vero. He stood in the doorway, his face unreadable, his eyes locked on her. The moment their gazes met, something shifted in the air, a subtle tension that neither of them could deny. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them louder than any words they might have shared. Finally, Vero broke the silence. "We need to talk." Eileen nodded, the knot in her stomach tightening. "What's happened?" Vero stepped into the room, his boots scuffing against the floor. He didn't answer her question immediately. Instead, he looked around the medical bay, his eyes scanning the wounded, the dead. His jaw tightened, a muscle twitching beneath his skin. The sight of his weariness hit her like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, she forgot about the distance. She forgot about the war. All she could see was the man she had once loved, standing before her, broken in ways she hadn't imagined. "It's getting worse," he finally said, his voice low, strained. "We've lost more ground. The government has mobilized more forces. They're pushing us into the corners of the city. It's only a matter of time before they come for us here." Eileen swallowed, her throat dry. The weight of his words hung in the air between them, as real and as tangible as the blood on the floor. "What do we do now?" Vero didn't answer immediately. He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers, as if searching for something. A flicker of emotion passed through his gaze, something raw and vulnerable, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "We fight," he said, his voice hardening. "We don't stop. We can't afford to." Eileen nodded, though her mind was far from the rebellion. She was still caught in the tension between them, the sense that they were no longer the same. The rebellion had changed them both, but it was more than that. There was a part of her that felt as though Vero was slipping away, and she couldn't pull him back. She couldn't even reach him anymore. "Vero," she began, her voice faltering. "I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can keep going." He looked at her, a flicker of something passing behind his eyes. Regret, maybe, or guilt. But whatever it was gone before Eileen could grasp it. "You don't have to," he said quietly. "I'm doing this for all of us. For you." The words stung more than she expected. She had always known that Vero would do whatever it took to win this war, but hearing him say it, hearing him imply that he was doing it for her, when she knew she couldn't help him anymore, was like a dagger twisting in her heart. She didn't know how to finish the sentence. How could she put into words the storm that raged within her? The love, the fear, the loss? Vero took a step back, his gaze shifting away from her, and in that moment, Eileen knew. The man she had loved, the man who had once cared for her with tenderness and understanding, was gone. In his place stood a leader, a man who would sacrifice everything for the cause, even if it meant sacrificing her. "You don't have to carry this weight alone," she whispered. But Vero didn't respond. He was already turning toward the door, already consumed by the war that had stolen him from her. As he disappeared down the hall, Eileen felt the loss of him like a physical ache. This was the reality of their rebellion now. This was the price of war. The first strike had been made, but it had cost them more than they had ever imagined. And in the quiet aftermath, Eileen knew there would be more losses to come. The war had only just begun. Chapter 14. When Darkness Blooms. Eileen could feel the tension in the air even before she saw the faces in the room. It was as though the very walls of the underground complex were closing in on her, squeezing out the last of the hope that had sustained her for so long. The rebellion was no longer just about the fight for freedom. It had become a battlefield of conflicting desires, hidden agendas, and unspoken alliances. And it seemed as though with each passing day, the line between friend and foe blurred further. She hadn't seen Vero for 2 days now, and that worried her more than she cared to admit. He had become increasingly distant since their conversation, retreating deeper into the shadows of his role as leader. It wasn't like him to shut her out, but she had learned that in times of war, people did things they wouldn't normally do. She had always known the cost of the rebellion would be high, but now, standing on the edge of everything she held dear, she wondered just how much it would take before they lost their humanity entirely. Eileen paced the hallway, the faint hum of the generator and the occasional murmur from the other rebels barely reaching her ears. It was as though the complex had become a mausoleum, the life drained out of it, leaving only the ghosts of what it once was. The rebels were still working tirelessly, coordinating the next phases of their plans, but the morale was slipping. They had lost too much too quickly, and the government's retaliation was more brutal than any of them had anticipated. She stopped in front of the command center, hesitating for just a moment before stepping inside. The room was dimly lit, the holographic displays casting eerie blue shadows across the faces of the rebel leaders gathered around the table. But it wasn't the projections that caught her attention. It was the tension that hung in the air. Everyone was on edge, and no one dared speak too loudly, as if the very words might tip them over the edge. Vero was at the center of the table, his hands pressed flat against the surface, his face a mask of stoic determination. But Eileen could see the weariness in his eyes. She had always known him to be driven, but now there was something almost desperate in his movements. He was running on fumes, and it was clear that the pressure of leadership was taking its toll. Without thinking, Eileen moved toward him. Her heart ached with every step she took. She wanted to reach him, to remind him of who they were before the war had consumed them. But the moment she stepped into the circle, Vero's eyes flickered to hers, and a coldness washed over his expression. His gaze was distant, detached, as though she were nothing more than another soldier to him. "Eileen," he greeted her. His voice clipped. "I'm surprised you're here." She swallowed the lump in her throat, trying to steady herself. "I wanted to know what's happening. I haven't seen you. I thought we could talk." Vero didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned back to the map in front of him, gesturing for the others to continue. Eileen could feel the weight of his rejection like a blade to the chest. She had come here hoping for some connection, some sign that they could still work together, but now it felt like she was nothing more than an outsider. "We're making our move tonight," he said, not looking up from the table. "The government forces are too spread out. This is our chance." Eileen's stomach dropped. She could hear the underlying sense of finality in his words. This was no longer about fighting for a cause. It was about survival. She didn't know how to approach him now. The man she loved seemed like a stranger. She could see the desperation in his eyes, but there was no trace of the warmth that had once been there. The fire that had ignited their relationship, that had driven them to fight for each other and for a better world, was now replaced with something colder, something darker. "I don't think we're ready," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "We don't have enough resources, and the government is. We don't have the luxury of waiting." "Eileen," Vero interrupted, his voice harsh, his patience clearly running thin. "Every day we hesitate, more people die, more of us fall. This is our chance to strike a blow they can't recover from. We can't afford to sit back." Eileen felt her heart race. She could see the conviction in his eyes, but it wasn't the same conviction that had brought them together. This was something different, something born of fear, of a desperation that made her blood run cold. She could feel the rebellion slipping away from them both, like sand through her fingers. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling now. "You're not just leading a fight anymore, Vero. You're leading us into something we might not come back from. You've already lost too much. I've already lost too much. Do you think I'm not scared? Do you think this doesn't terrify me?" Vero's eyes darkened, his expression unreadable. But when he spoke, his voice was low and strained, as though the weight of the words pained him. "I don't have the luxury of fear anymore, Eileen. I have to lead us, even if it means making decisions I never wanted to make." The finality in his words hit her like a physical blow. She wanted to argue, to make him see reason, but there was nothing left to say. The man she loved had become someone else, a man who was willing to sacrifice everything, even the people who had once been closest to him. She stepped back, her heart aching with every movement. "I can't do this, Vero. I can't follow you down this path." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes. Regret, maybe, or pain. But it was gone just as quickly. "You have no choice. We all do." The words stung, and Eileen felt a tear slip down her cheek before she could stop it. She wiped it away quickly, trying to compose herself, but it was too late. The damage had been done. Vero didn't reach out to her. He didn't offer a hand of comfort. Instead, he turned back to the map, already lost in the mission at hand. And just like that, she was invisible again. She had become a ghost in his eyes. As she left the command center, the weight of his words settled deep in her chest. The rebellion was no longer just a fight for freedom. It had become a war for survival. And in this new world, there was no room for the people they once were. There was only the cold, harsh reality of what they had become. And as Eileen walked away, her heart heavy with loss, she couldn't shake the feeling that the true battle was no longer against the government. It was against the darkness that was creeping into their hearts, and once it took hold, it would consume them all. Chapter 15. The Promise of Forever. The night air was heavy with the scent of rain, the world holding its breath as if awaiting something inevitable. Eileen stood at the edge of the rebel compound, the wind tugging at her cloak, her thoughts spiraling in every direction. She had not seen Vero in days, but she could feel the pull of his absence in every corner of the complex. It was as though the space between them had grown too vast to bridge, the distance a chasm that neither of them knew how to cross. Everything had changed since their last conversation. The rebellion was moving forward with or without them, and Vero's decisions were becoming more extreme, more detached. He was no longer the man who had held her hand in the quiet moments, who had whispered dreams of a better world in the darkest hours. Now, he was a leader consumed by the weight of his own vision, a vision that no longer included her. The sounds of the rain echoed in her ears, mixing with the distant hum of generators and the occasional shout of rebels preparing for the next stage of the campaign. The quiet was both oppressive and comforting, a reminder of how far they had come and how much they had lost along the way. Eileen closed her eyes, trying to steady her racing thoughts. She had made a choice that was as much about survival as it was about the person she had become in the wake of the war. She couldn't stand by and watch Vero sacrifice everything for the cause, not when it meant losing herself in the process. She had always believed in the fight, in the dream of a better world, but somewhere along the way, the rebellion had become a war that was slowly eroding the very things they had once fought for. But there was something else pulling at her, something she had felt in the depths of her soul. The rebellion was no longer just a fight for freedom. It had become a fight for their souls. And in this fight, she had to choose who she would be. Her resolve hardened. She couldn't change the course of the rebellion, but she could make one last stand for herself. She couldn't let it consume her entirely, not when she had already given so much. The decision had been made long before, but now, as the rain fell harder around her, it felt final. She could no longer stay in the shadows, silently watching as everything she loved slipped further into the dark. She couldn't remain on the edge of the world she had once known, hoping for a chance to rebuild something that had already been lost. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching, the faint clatter of boots on wet pavement. Eileen turned, her heart leaping into her throat. She had hoped it wasn't him, but her hopes were dashed when Vero stepped into view, his figure dark and imposing against the backdrop of the storm. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to stop. "Eileen," he said, his voice carrying the weight of their shared history, the bond that had once held them together. But now, it was only a shadow of what it had been. "I thought I might find you here." She didn't know how to respond. The words caught in her throat, and she felt a wave of sadness crash over her. She had wanted to tell him so much, to make him understand the turmoil that had been building inside her. But now, the words seemed too heavy, too final. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but it was the only truth she could speak in that moment. Vero's eyes flickered with something. Surprise, maybe, or disbelief. He took a step closer, his movements slow, cautious. "Leaving?" he repeated, as if the word itself didn't quite register in his mind. "I can't stay," Eileen replied, her hands trembling at her sides. "I can't keep fighting for something I don't believe in anymore. Not when it means losing myself. Not when it means losing you." There was a long pause, and in that moment, Eileen could see the war waging inside him, the same one that had been consuming her. The weight of the rebellion, of their shattered world, pressed down on his shoulders, and she could see the cost in his eyes. He was tired. He had become someone she no longer recognized. "I never wanted this for us," Vero said quietly, his voice strained. But this war is bigger than us, Eileen. It's bigger than anything we could have imagined. Eileen shook her head, the tears threatening to fall. I know that, but you're not the man I fell in love with anymore. And I'm not the woman I used to be. We've both changed, and I don't know if we can come back from that. Vero took another step forward, his hand reaching for her, but she stepped back, instinctively pulling away. She could feel the ache in her chest, the longing to return to the days before the war, before everything had fractured beyond repair. But that world was gone. The person she had been was gone, and the person Vero had become. He was slipping through her fingers like smoke. I'm sorry, she whispered, the words barely audible over the storm. But I can't do this anymore. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was deafening, the weight of their broken bond filling the space between them. The storm raged on, but Eileen couldn't tell if the tears on her face were from the rain or from the loss that had settled so deeply in her heart. Finally, Vero spoke, his voice low and hollow. I never wanted you to be a casualty of this war. Eileen looked up at him one last time, her heart breaking at the man he had become, the man she had once loved. There was nothing left to say, no words that could undo the damage they had done to each other. I know, she said, her voice cracking, but sometimes we're forced to choose between the fight and the person we used to be. With one last look, she turned and walked away, her steps slow but determined. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stay here any longer. Not in the ruins of a world that had already consumed them. Vero didn't call after her. He didn't try to stop her. And as Eileen disappeared into the rain-soaked night, she realized that, in the end, their love had been just another casualty of the war. And now, it was time to walk away, alone.